was something about you guys.
I know Themba LABS is here down at the back.
Ek het daar verbygery nou eendag.
I don't know what they do there.
They are one of the
Something about diagnostics.
Maar ek weet nie presies wat daar aangaan nie.
one of the scientific facilities here in Easterwood.
Welcome to NRF-iThemba LABS, the laboratory for accelerator-based science. I can just imagine that you've got many questions. One, what is an accelerator and what would be the science that we do here? Join me as I take you on a little tour. Wow, look at this place, as if it's out of a science fiction movie. In our normal lives, what we see depends on what we use as a light source. In the game of NRF-iThemba LABS, we see by using charged particles that we accelerate using big machines. In actual fact, we have a machine at NRF-iThemba LABS that can accelerate a proton to a speed, and if you convert it into numbers, the speed is so high that the proton can go 4 times around the Earth in 1 second. But I'm not the guru on accelerators. Let me introduce you to my friend, Cyclotron, and he will tell you all about this thing behind me.
Hi, my name is Cyclotron. I am head of accelerator operations at NRF-iThemba LABS. So allow me to give you a brief introduction into accelerator physics at NRF-iThemba LABS. So we start our journey at the ion source. So this is an example of an ion source. An ion source is a device where one puts in a gas and remove the electrons, turning gas atoms into ions. From this point, we transport the ions down stainless steel beam pipes into the cyclotron. So the cyclotron basically consists of a magnetic field that confines the particles in the so-called median plane. So the particles move in a circle. Every time the particles move in a circle, it gets exposed to an electric field, to an acceleration gap, which accelerates the particles at the acceleration gap. As a result of this acceleration, the particles gets an energy peak and moves into a larger orbit. This process continues a number of times inside the cyclotron up until the point that the particle gets extracted from the cyclotron and gets taken to the transfer beamline to the bigger cyclotron for the acceleration. This is what the transfer beamline looks like. And in the transfer beamline, one has a number of magnetic components. So the two I want to point out is the quadrupoles. So you have a number of charged particles, all with the same charge. These particles tend to repel one another in the transverse directions. The quadrupole magnet compresses the charged particles in the transverse direction. Then one also changes the direction of the charged particles using a so-called dipole magnet, and this is what the dipole magnet looks like. Apart from that, we also have a number of diagnostics, which is given by, which is shown here by these types of things, and we have compressed air and water cooling on the different components.
Alright, so in the world of accelerator-based science, we have ions, and they get accelerated. But when small things need to move, we have to make sure that there's nothing in their way. So let's go and meet up with Wayne and find out how he deals with our problem linked to vacuum.
Good day, my name is Wayne, and I will be discussing our vacuum systems and beamlines here at NRF-iThemba LABS. To understand a vacuum system, we must understand that currently, as we're all standing here or sitting there, we have atmosphere pressure acting on us. That is the air around you. Now that at sea level is measured at 101.3 or 0.6 kilopascals. Now to understand what a vacuum system is, vacuum is the absence of air in a container or a chamber. If these beamlines were only filled with air, the air molecules would knock the protons and neutrons out of alignment, which means they will be scattered all over the place. So we at NRF-iThemba LABS remove the air out of the beamline to create a vacuum. Therefore, nothing is in the beamline besides the proton and neutrons. Here we have an example of a vacuum pumping station at NRF-iThemba LABS. It consists of mainly 2 types of pumps which work in conjunction. Here we have a full vacuum pump, and over here we have a turbo pump. On the pumping station we have as well gauge heads which measure the vacuum pressure, and a vacuum valve which separates the pumping station from our beamline. So if you need to do any maintenance or repairs on our systems here, we will just close this valve and separate it from this vacuum system. Here we're in our vacuum lab here at NRF-iThemba LABS. This is where we work on and service all our different vacuum pumps. Here I have an example of a scroll vacuum pump. Let me explain to you how these pumps work. On the pump here we have our inlet port. At the bottom we have the exhaust port. So this pump will suck in air through this port, compress it and push it out here. That would create a vacuum on this port. Here, looking at the inside of this pump, let me explain to you how this works. This is the scroll. The scroll consists of two parts, which is the mating scroll. So as this pump is turning, the scroll is oscillating. And as it is spinning around, it will be sucking in the air through this port, pulling it around through the scroll while it's spinning up against these scrolls and compressing the air more and more and more until it gets to the center, and then it'll get pushed out. That is how the vacuum is created on this port.
All right, so we have irons, and you heard that we use machines to accelerate them and steer them. And then we have beam lines that bring them to where they are needed. But who are some of the people who use the stuff that's on the other end of this beam line? Let's go and meet my colleague Johan and learn more.
Hello everyone and welcome to the K600 magnetic spectrometer facility. In this facility we study a multitude of things using radioactive nuclei. In particular, we can study things that are related to nuclear astrophysics. So we look at the nuclear reactions that make stars shine. Those are one of the things that I am really interested in, and that is the type of research I like to conduct. And I do that research with this facility. Now, when we use this facility, we have this beam line that comes from the SSC, and the beam line delivers all of the particles at near speed of light velocities that impinge upon our target in the K600 magnetic spectrometer. Along the beam line, you'll see various components. The first of these components that you see here next to me are called the quadrupoles. The quadrupoles we use to focus the beam particles, just like you would focus a beam of light with a laser, for instance. As we move on, we'll see various components such as these ones, these little blue ones that we use to steer the beam particles. We need to steer the beam particles because we have a little target that we need to hit at precisely the right point so that we can create the nuclear reactions that we are interested in seeing. In the center between those two components, we see what we call a Hatanaka harp. We use these in order to visualize the beam particles because as they hit the special materials that we have inside that chamber, it creates radiation in the form of light. And we use that light to determine whether our beam is actually aligned and whether it will hit our target correctly. And as we move further along the beam line, we're able to see some of the other components that we use here at the spectrometer. For instance, we use this detection system that we call BAGEL. BAGEL is a set of gamma detectors that we use to see and detect the gamma rays that come from excited nuclear particles. So those nuclear particles were given a certain amount of energy from the beam particles, and by exciting them to a high energy state, we look at their cascading gamma decays. So looking at those gamma rays, which are high energy photons or high energy particles of light, we can conclude what kind of structures and what kind of deformities those nuclei have in particular. So this soccer ball shape is the frame upon which BAGEL is mounted, where we use various Clover detectors as well as something that we call lanthanum bromide detectors in order to visualize and detect those high energy gamma ray particles. So after our particles have come down the beam line, we reach what is the heart of the K600 magnetic spectrometer facility, because within this part, which we call the scattering chamber, is where the nuclear reactions actually take place. We use those nuclear reactions to create, for instance, the nuclear reactions that happen on the surfaces of very, very exotic stars. For instance, stars that are called neutron stars with immensely high gravitational fields and very, very strong abilities to create interesting and poignant nuclear reactions. So once our nuclear reactions take place within the scattering chamber, the nuclei that are now energized have to decay in some sort of way. It is at that point in time that we have those little things called ejectiles, which are small clusters of nuclei and nucleons that are emitted from the excited nuclear reaction. So those nucleons and those nuclei move into the K600 magnetic spectrometer's bending magnets. This large blue structure that you see here is a very large magnet that we can turn on simply by using an electric current. So it's not a permanent magnet, but we use it in order to separate and measure the spectral components of these particular physical phenomena that we are studying. So that is the main job of a spectrometer. It's a scientific instrument that we use to measure and separate the spectral phenomena that occur within the scattering chamber due to the nuclear reactions. And after it goes through what we call the bending magnets, the spectral components are separated and we can distinguish between different excited states in very important nuclei. And by doing so, we can, for instance, look at compound nuclei, for instance, magnesium-22, which was very specific to my type of research, where I looked at X-ray bursts, which are very large and sudden increases in X-ray luminosity that happen in deep space and even in our own galaxy, where we're able to look at the nuclear reactions that cause those sudden and explosive X-ray events.
I'm so glad that you are on this journey with me to see ITHEMBA, this fascinating place with interesting people. Let's go meet my colleague Elena, and she will tell you all about Aphrodite.
My name is Elena Lori, and I'm a senior researcher at CHandetron Labs. I'm working here with this equipment that is the Aphrodite array at CHandetron Labs, with which we are studying nuclei. So, how does that work? These particles in nuclei, they're so tiny that we cannot really see them. We make them to interact with each other. And when they interact, we look what happens to them. We put lots of detectors around them to watch what's happening, and we record all the emissions that come from these nuclei. We record the radiation, and based on this, we actually understand what is the properties of these very tiny particles, nuclei and other things. So in order to do that, we have accelerated projectiles that is produced in our accelerator here at CHandetron Labs, and it comes from that side of the wall. So it moves into vacuum and comes here in the center of this target chamber. Here at the center of the target chamber, we have another foil of nuclei where the interactions happens. And this is where these nuclei become produced with very high excitation energy. And this high excitation energy is then dissipated through emitting gamma rays, which from here then come into our detectors. So all the site of the interaction is surrounded by the detectors that you see here, and they detect the gamma rays that are emitted. So what are these gamma rays? Gamma rays are the same as light, the visual light that we see, but they're about 1 million times more energetic. So these tiny little particles that we are studying in generally have a lot of energy, and it is emitted by different ways, but here we are studying the gamma ray emissions. So the detectors that we have here are specifically made to detect gamma rays. They are very sensitive for gamma rays, and we've got many of them because although they are so specialized, gamma rays are extremely difficult to detect, and therefore even with all these detectors we detect only about 2% of the gamma rays that are actually emitted from the nuclei. What you see here, it looks like one detector at each different positions, but in fact these are two detectors. We've got inside the germanium detector that is the sensitive one for the gamma rays, and around it this square face that is seen here actually represents a second detector which is meant to reduce the background. These detectors, like I was saying, they're very special. In order to operate, they need to be at very low temperature. So we're talking about liquid nitrogen temperature. That's why, while the detector is right in front, here in the back we've got a container in which we put liquid nitrogen in order to cool the detector and to make it work properly without a lot of background. In order to keep the detector cold, this dewar is filled twice per day with liquid nitrogen. And we have an automatic system that will do that. So once the gamma rays come into the detector, we can detect the energy that it is carrying. We can detect the angular momentum, the parity, and other things. And based on the recordings of all these properties, we can figure out what is the features of the nuclei. What do they do if they absorb energy? For instance, some nuclei, when they receive extra energy, what they do is they change their deformation. For instance, they were spherical, but then they deform and start looking like a rugby ball. Other nuclei actually use this extra energy in order to rotate, so they are moving. They are nuclei that like to vibrate. And in fact, the nuclei may actually do all of those things, just depending on how much energy they would absorb. Studying nuclei is extremely interesting and very complex because they have so many options, so many different ways of using the energy. Here we study nuclei, and when I say we study them, we really look for new properties that no one else in the world has ever seen. So this is producing new knowledge about these tiny little particles. The data is used not just for finding all these new things, but also for making PhD and MSc projects, and we work in very close collaborations with the University of the Western Cape, with the Universities of Stellenbosch, University of Cape Town, as well as the universities in the north, like University of Johannesburg and other universities. So with this data, it's used for MSCs and for PhD projects. And now I want to introduce to you our MSc student, Ulazi Shabani.
Hi, I'm Skanyu Ulazi Shabani, working at iThemba Lab. I'm a student from University of Johannesburg, currently doing my second year master's at iThemba Lab. Working at iThemba Lab has taught me a lot of skills. I do not only learn how to handle radiation and study to find new things and try to change the world, but I also learn how to use softwares like Radware, which are needed at workplace. Those programs, they are tricky but interesting to use.
iThemba Labs makes use of accelerators to do research. Here we are at the CHandetron laboratory, and here's my friend Khashani.
Welcome to the CHandetron facility. My name is Khashani Malaji. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at iThemba Labs, and today I'll take you through the CHandetron facility. Here we are. So welcome guys again to the CHandetron facility. This is where we accelerate the beams and they go down to the experimental stations. So now I'll take you again to the experimental station to go and show you where we perform our reactions and our experiments. Follow me. We perform low energy nuclear reactions compared to what they normally perform at the SSC, where they have 200 MeV proton beams. Here we have only 6 MeV proton beams. And then once we perform this reaction, the idea is to check this nuclear reaction and then learn or understand how elements are being produced in the universe. So what we do here is actually making mini star explosions compared to actual star explosions. So we have mini star explosions in this very lab. So this is where the nuclear reaction happens. This is the target chamber. As the beam comes from the CHandetron, it gets switched through the magnet and then it comes through to our target chamber. This is where the nuclear reaction happens. Here we have the targets. In this case, at the moment, we have a nickel isotope target, so nickel 60. And the beam impinges on the target, making a nuclear reaction. Then the reactant, which now is gamma radiation, is detected with this detector. This acts like a microscope to see what exactly took place in this reaction. Now, we can use this information to understand how elements are being made in the universe. Because you come with a beam which is protons, you detect it. You pinch on the nucleus and then you emit radiation. This is exactly the same process that takes place in the universe. And it's used now, this process, to make new elements in the universe. Now, once we detect the radiation with this lobas or the mirrors, we can take this information to try and read it with our electronics in order to disentangle the signals into energy and time.
We live in a world of big things, cars and buildings, but what happens when we want to see small stuff? Come with me as we chat to some of my colleagues in radiobiology.
Moving away from the big infrastructures at NRF-iThemba LABS and the particle accelerator, here we are at the Radiation Biophysics division. In this division, we perform research on the small things. In particular, we look at the effects of radiation on the cells of the human body. And our research is divided in two major fields, which is cancer detection and therapy, and secondly, radiation protection. Our preclinical cancer research includes research on radiosensitizer drugs, which are drugs or chemical compounds that enhance the lethal effects of radiation. Secondly, we also conduct research that investigates why elephants are cancer resistant. And in the field of nuclear medicine, we do research on radiopharmaceuticals to image and treat cancer, an emerging field called theranostics. Theranostics is a combination of the terms therapeutics and diagnostics, used to describe the combination of using one radioactive drug to identify or diagnose a tumor and a second radioactive drug to deliver therapy to treat the tumor. The assays we perform at the lab evaluate the effects of radiation and anti-cancer drugs on blood or cancer cells. For example, we treat the cancer cells and quantify how many cells died, how much DNA damage was induced, or if the drug decreases the migration or invasion of cancer cells. What is unique at NRF-iThemba LABS is that we are also investigating the potential of proton and neutron beams produced by our cyclotron for cancer therapy. A major advantage of these is that they can target the tumor more specifically and prevent damage to normal tissues. Our second research field is radiation protection. This includes research on biological effects of ionizing radiation on astronauts involved in space missions. In particular, exposure to space radiation represents a serious potential long-term threat to the health of astronauts because the amount of radiation exposure accumulates during their time in space. Secondly, in the field of radiation protection, we are the only lab in South Africa offering a biodosimetry service, where we evaluate blood samples of potentially overexposed radiation workers. By detecting biological markers, we are able to quantify the radiation exposure of the individual. Currently, our team consists of 8 staff members and on average 10 master students and PhD students in collaboration with local universities to advance knowledge in this critical skill in South Africa.
So NRF-iThemba LABS is this fascinating place with fascinating people. We've got researchers doing some amazing things, but we also have some technical people. We even have engineers. So let me introduce you to Justin, one of our engineers involved in the production of isotopes.
Hi, I'm Justin and welcome to our safe prototype vault. So what you're looking at here is a prototype for our safe target station. That's the South African Isotope Facility target station. So this prototype is to emulate a target station that we'll be using in our final production vaults. So at NRF-iThemba LABS we produce isotopes. So to produce isotopes you irradiate a cold material with a proton beam typically from a cyclotron. So the cold material would be housed in something like this, which is a target capsule. And this target capsule is then placed in a target station, and that's where the reaction takes place. So this prototype target station is skeletal in its form here, The actual target station will have a fair amount of lead shielding around it to capture the neutron and gamma rays that emanate from the reaction. So the beam from the cyclotron would enter at the front of the target station. The beam then travels through a collimator, which makes sure that the beam is in the center of the beam pipe. It then irradiates the target, which is held within a target holder. As part of this process, there's a lot of heat generated, so there's water cooling involved to keep the target cool. Of course, once the target is irradiated, it's very active, so you've got to be able to load and unload the target remotely, robotically, and so we have this robot arm to do that. Some of the additional infrastructure that's required, we would have a transporter system to transport the active materials away from this facility to our processing facility. This target station also has the ability to open, so these shields actually separate apart. So when the reaction is taking place, the shield is completely closed. But once the reaction is done, which could take several days at a time, we would then remotely open the shield and then use the robotic arm to extract the target and then take it away using the transporter. So what we're looking at here is a 3D rendering of the final safe production station. So the prototype is just the guts of this target station. But here you can see the fairly large lead shielding that's required to contain the neutron and gamma rays that come out of the reaction. So once again, this is a rendering of the beam line. This is the last section of the beam line. So on the other side of the wall is the actual cyclotron from which the beam comes. And on the wall here, you can see all the pneumatic panels that provide the compressed air for the robotic arm and the various pneumatic systems. This is the water manifold. So the water comes from a chiller, then through an intermediary, then through a primary loop, finally to the target station. And then we have final control over these valves that we use to send water to the target station. And then up here you can see that the transporter is a lot more expanded. In fact, it runs from here through a wall and it travels another 200 meters or so to get to the facility where it's processed.
They say it takes a village to raise a child, but in the world of science, we need various stakeholders to make a contribution. Let me introduce you to my colleague Ambrose Yaga, and he will tell us more about science engagement.
Hi, my name is Ambrose Yaga. I am the manager of a division here at NRF-iThemba LABS called Science Engagement. The objective of Science Engagement Group is to promote science and technology awareness in public spaces, which include schools. We do this by putting together a number of programs such as science education support, public tours, public lectures, open days. It is very important for a group of people like ourselves to go into the school space and make sure that we try and feed the pipeline that will produce science, technology and engineering skills, and hence our presence in science support space. At high schools, we support science teachers by going around in a few selected high schools, local, and we do science demonstrations. We motivate learners so that they do well in the subject of mathematics and science. As you would know, it is a well-documented fact that our schools tend not to do very well in these subjects of science and mathematics. So we do science demonstrations. Because NRF-iThemba LABS is multidisciplinary facility with the skills set that I mentioned, we leverage on that point by putting together also a number of science career sessions for our learners, where learners can get guidance from people that have already made success out of set careers, get guidance where to study, and how to study.
Thanks for joining me on this amazing journey. Who would have thought that all of this is possible at the tip of Africa? NRF-iThemba LABS is a research facility of the National Research Foundation, committed to advancing knowledge, to transform lives, and to inspire a nation. So if you're close to us, if you're in the vicinity, why don't you pop in to come and not just see our amazing science, but to meet some of the amazing people who work here. We've got 2 campuses, one here in Cape Town and the other one up in Johannesburg. See you soon.